Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video we're going to be diving into Protection Warrior in Season 3 of The War Within, going over their talent tree overhaul, raid and mythic plus talent choices, tips for optimizing your rotation and survivability, plus a lot more. Before we actually get into that stuff though, I did want to quickly just run down the spec itself and how it actually plays for anyone that might be either new to Prot Warrior specifically or even just the game itself. Essentially, it's a pretty simple builder spender spec with rage as its primary resource. You generate this by using some of your lower cooldown abilities like Shield Slam or Thunderclap, and then you spend that rage either defensively with things like Ignore Pain and Shield Block, or offensively with things like Revenge for AoE damage or Execute on low health targets. Notably, one of these spenders in Shield Block is actually your primary form of active mitigation, so it's extremely important to maintain that buff in order to actually stay alive. So getting that buff uptime as close to 100% possible is very important. Rotationally, Prot is also a very proc heavy spec, meaning that the abilities you're pressing at any given time is going to change in terms of the priority based on the procs that are actually happening, so no two pulls are going to feel the same. This combined with those off the global cooldown defensives that we mentioned earlier, like Ignore Pain, do push the APM very high in this spec as a whole, which some may not like, but personally I am a big fan of. Of course, I've overly simplified things here a bit, but you kind of get it, and we'll get into more details later on in the video. Instead, let's pivot and talk about the changes coming in patch 11.2, of which there are many. Most importantly, though, are these very significant changes to the talent tree specifically for Protection Warrior. There's a lot coming here. There's a bunch of like flat percentage changes, some new talents, some talents being removed. In terms of the overall highlights, I would say Challenging Shout is now baseline, so that's +1 talent point. Bloodborne is now more accessible. That was amplifying your bleeds. Now it's more powerful and it's easier to take. And also Spell Block has been removed entirely. That last one definitely stings Mythic Plus players a bit. Though with some of the other adjustments, Prot Warrior is getting to other talents, some new builds potentially opening up, the new tier bonuses coming in. I don't think that loss is the end of the world. And if you're looking at raid specifically, that talent was already a bit niche. It was good when it was good, but generally it was not super useful. And you have some new other tools that I think will be more generally useful in a raid environment to replace it. Like I said, a lot changing here. I'm not going to go into specifics right now, but if there are any impactful changes when we talk about the talent section of this video, that's when I will try and point out all of these adjustments. From there, we can talk about the other major new thing coming in this patch, and that is the new tier set bonuses, where yes, it is plural, because for those that don't know, these are actually based around the hero specs now instead of the spec itself, meaning Prot Warrior has a different tier bonus for Mountain Thane and Colossus. So starting off here, we have the Mountain Thane tier bonus. So your two-piece here, Thunder Blast, has a 35% chance to call down 5 ionizing strikes on affected targets. Each strike deals nature damage. So some additional nature damage to 5 targets with Thunder Blast. Then the 4-piece bonus, these ionizing strikes deal 100% more damage, so doubling the damage of the 2-piece. And when you trigger ionizing strikes, you gain a charge of Thunder Blast, and your next Thunder Blast deals 100% additional damage. So basically, your Thunder Blast now has a 35% chance to reset the cooldown of Thunder Blast. So you are just Thunder Blasting more. I am a Thane gang enjoyer. I love playing Mountain Thane in Season 1. It was a little sad to see it kind of fall behind Colossus in Season 2, but, you know, I think this is just making Mountain Thane more Mountain Thane-y. You're Thunder Blasting more often. You're doing a bunch more lightning nature damage stuff. It's cool. I like it. I'm a fan, and it is quite powerful. Now let me change specs here so we can actually see the Colossus tier bonus and what that looks like. And this one is a bit more focused around bleeds. So looking at that, you have the 2-piece here. Demolish damage increased by 20%, and critical strike damage of your abilities is increased by up to 20% on your targets affected by your demolish for 10 seconds based on the number of stacks of colossal might consumed. So this is just further empowering the debuff that you put on people when you demolish them. So again, feeding into that whole, like, this is your damage amp window that you want to dump your cooldown abilities into. And the 4-piece here, Demolish increases the critical strike chance of your next 1 shield slam by 100%. Shield Slam critical strikes increase your rend and deep wounds damage by 80% for 8 seconds. And then that buff, it just happens, right? So if you just Shield Slam crit, even without the 4-piece bonus, it will trigger that bleed buff, which really, really amps up bleed damage, which, as we'll see later, synergizes with some of the other talents. We've already talked about Bloodborne, but there's also Fueled by Violence, which is another talent that it synergizes pretty heavily with. Damage output wise, this is falling a bit behind Mountain Thane, I would say. Though if you are a Colossus enjoyer, I don't think it's so far behind that you couldn't play it. And there are some scenarios where this is defensively at least a bit better than Mountain Thane, I would say. Next up, we can dive into the actual talents of these specs, and I am going to focus a little bit more on the Mountain Thane stuff just because, as I mentioned, it is outperforming Colossus in both Raid and Mythic Plus currently. But there are some things to keep in mind. One, the general tree for Warrior is pretty similar for both in both forms of content, so that's not really going to change too much. And I'll still cover an example of a Colossus build later on, just to kind of show you how the builds actually differ and why they differ in those ways. Plus, all the talent strings are going to be linked in the description below if you want to import them for yourself. So starting at Mythic Plus and the general tree, very similar to before, right? Nothing's really changed here. So talent-wise, it's very similar, right? You want to get your utility in Mythic Plus, so you're grabbing Shockwave, you're grabbing Stormbolt, right? That kind of thing. In terms of the capstone area, I have Spec into Thunderous Roar. It doesn't really matter between Thunderous Roar and Champion Spear. Champion Spear is going to give you bigger burst. Thunderous Roar you get to use more frequently. It helps a little bit with aggro, though that's not like a huge issue for Mountain Thane, I'd say. So you can kind of go personal preference here between Champion Spear and Thunderous Roar, whichever you prefer. And then in terms of flex talents, basically you can shift around a couple points here. So double time is one of the optional talents. It's a little bit less valuable in a dungeon environment, though it does feel weird to have one charge of charge. So if you want that instead, you can move things like Rumbling Earth around. If you want this, you can move things like Rallying Cry. It's pretty weak cooldown anyway, so you don't necessarily need it. You can also move around Honed Reflexes, as that's not needed either. So any of these talents are pretty flexible, as is Crackling Thunder as well, actually. Though this is, quality of life on Thunderclap for Mountain Thane, where you really wanted to hit everything in the pack. So that's pretty nice for that. But it is technically droppable. You have a lot of different choices you can make here. Bounding Stride as well. But again, I personally never want to spec out a Bounding Stride, but you can do it if you want to pick up one of those other talents. And you'll notice I am spec'd out of Intervene here. This Intervene shield is very, very weak. It's like still sub 1 million, even in Season 3 when people have, 10 plus million health pools as DPSers. Tanks are like over 20 million, right? So it's a tiny shield, not really value. And then this one just makes the cooldown of Stormbolt longer and then also makes it target 2 random things. So prefer not to have that on my Stormbolt. And so that's why we end up doing the Storm Shield without Intervene talent. You can spec Intervene if you want to drop Stormbolt or something like that, but it's not really worthwhile. Before we get into the actual spec tree, I want to briefly touch on the Mountain Thane interactions. So basically the whole bit with Mountain Thane is that you have these lightning strikes that go out. These lightning strikes are also called down by Thunder Blast. Thunder Blast is procced by Shield Slam. So these lightning strikes, they go out, they generate rage, and then they have a chance to reset your Shield Slam, let you cast 2 of them back to back with no cooldown, which then goes back to the whole Shield Slam can proc these Thunder Blasts, and these Thunder Blasts can proc more of these Lightning Strikes, and so it's just this big feedback loop. So that's kind of the whole Mountain Thane bit with how the gameplay loop works and how you generate so much rage. You Thunder Blast a lot, you get a lot of these Lightning Strike damage, so that's how that actually functions, and that's why this three combo of talents right here is very, very powerful. Now, moving into the actual spec tree, you see there are a lot of changes to the shape of it. So let's start at the top here. Basically going down, I, in the Mythic Plus build, have opted for Disrupting Shout. I am a huge Disrupting Shout fan. I love this talent. If you are not using it, obviously, it's less valuable, and you can spec this into damage if best served cold. But personally, and I think a lot of other Prot warriors are probably going to be dropping Best Served Cold in order to exchange or get Disrupting Shout. Next, you have this choice note here in order to progress to Strategist, which is an important Shield Slam proc. You have 6% armor or 4% magic DR. You can kind of pick here which one you want. Generally, I'm going to go with the armor because it's also synergized with Armor to the Teeth over here. So that's why I've taken the armor. But you can pick either. If you're taking specifically heavy magic damage in a dungeon, you can opt to take that as well. Moving down the tree here, We have opted to spec over into Thunderlord. You'll notice like a bunch of builds actually don't do this because it's essentially 2 points to buy Thunderlord with how bad Last Stand is. But we are going to do that in keys because with the amount of Thunder Blast you're ripping out as Mountain Thane, especially with the tier bonus, you get so much CDR on Demo Shout, which is super valuable. Other things in this area might be a little weird is Sudden Death. We are taking Sudden Death because we are also taking Cleaving Executes in this build. Now, this is 2 talent points that you could remove. If you're like, hey, I don't want to do that. I want to be a turtle. I want to be a turtle. You can do that. And in exchange, you can drop this talent and you can either pick up Blood Surge for even more rage if you want that for some reason, though Mountain Thane's already very heavy on the rage. Or you can spec into something like Hunker Down, which is a new talent here that gives you 2% avoidance and also increases the DR on Spell Reflect by 10%. So that flat DR, if you're using that a lot in certain dungeons, it can be quite strong if you take Hunker Down. So that's an option. And then similarly, if you don't want this one, you can instead opt to either move this also into the other one, into Blood Surge if you wanted that. You could move this into Indomitable if you want the extra health and a bit of sustain, or you could move this into Whirling Blade. That's probably where I would recommend it. So if you're doing like a defensive oriented build, I think this is what I would recommend. But you have so much rage and so much ignore pains that you pump out as Mountain Thane in this current tier that I really am a big fan of this Sudden Death Cleaving Execute build. It lets you do a ton of stuff, like you get the Execute procs, you can cleave that when you actually get procs. Also, if you pull like trash onto bosses or priority targets, you can execute the low health mobs onto the boss. It's a lot of damage. It's really valuable. It's a lot of fun. You can also amp it up even more if you want to take Massacre over here. I don't recommend that specifically, but that is another thing that you can do for even more damage. It's a really, really fun build. Would definitely recommend trying it out. But again, you can adjust it as needed if you want to be a bit more defensive. If we instead want to take a look at the raid build, we see a few things are changing. One, we don't need those same like stun abilities and utility abilities generally in raid. So we just take intervene to path down instead. We cut these for like a point in overwhelming rage and stuff like that. But if you do ever need like shockwave for a boss, which is possible, you can, you know, swap stuff over in order to grab it. You generally want rally in a raid environment because you're affecting a lot more people. And then specifically for Mountain Thane in raid, Champion Spear, the burst value is much more significant in raid because, you know, the whole threat value thing of Thunderous Roar is not really a thing in a raid environment. And so you can sync this up with your avatar presses when you instantly get those 2 Thunder Blast charges and just go to town with the extra crit damage in your spear. So that's like a little burst window you can do as a Mountain Thane warrior, which is pretty valuable. And then that extra point, instead of going into piercing challenge, goes over here for some more execute damage, because again, in the actual spec tree, we've gone pretty heavy into the execute stuff. So top, we don't need Disrupting Shout generally, so we move back into Best Served Cold. And then moving down, we have flat execute damage here. We have flat or execute at a higher health threshold here. And if you really need to as well, by the way, you can spec into this on cleave boss fights. I believe you have the ability to move one of these points out. So that Blood Surge can go over here in like a fight like Soul Hunters, which is just 3 boss targets the whole time, so this is going to be pretty valuable. But generally, it's not really something you're going to use. And then you can see to actually avoid these points, we have spec'd out of Thunderlord and Last Stand. Again, for the most part, you're hitting 1 target in a raid environment. If you can ever abuse target counts to get more Thunderlord CDR consistently, it could be valuable. But if you're fighting like 1 boss, you know, you'd rather have the extra rage gen, this execute stuff. Hunker Down is super valuable in a raid environment because most of that stuff isn't reflectable or deflectable. So this is just a 10% DR addition on top of Spiral Reflect, which makes it really, really chunky, which is very, very nice. And also, if you really want to, you can get more of these defensive options. Again, I move these into things like Hunker Down, but if you're like, hey, I don't really need the magic damage, I'm taking a lot of blockable stuff, or I want the cheat death or whatever, you can take some of this rage gen out as well, put it in there, right? So you have the options to move around here to be a bit more defensive if you need it, to be a bit more AoE spec'd if you need it. So it all just depends on the specific scenario. So move that around as needed. Then let's quickly touch on Colossus, like I was talking about earlier, where this is going to be a bit more bleed focused. So off the top here, actually, this, again, same deal, Rumbling Earth, you know, double time, rallying cry, all that stuff is the same in this side of the tree, so don't worry about that. Here we're doing more bleed stuff, and so we have Fueled by Violence, which has been buffed. It's 150% of the damage dealt by deep wounds specifically. We also have Bloodborne. It's now 1 point. It's now 25% deep wounds and rend damage. So it's a much bigger number for one singular point. And so this combined with the bleed damage amp from your 4-piece makes not only crit more valuable, but also makes you do a ton more damage from bleeds, which makes this heal for a ton. This gives you way more sustain than Prot Warrior has ever really had, which is kind of interesting. It's brand new to this season with this rework and this specifically this tier bonus for Colossus. So that can be really good if you're taking a lot of heavy dot damage intake or just rot damage intake in general, which, you know, Prot Warrior has historically not been super great against. And so this is something to counteract that. Also less Thunder Blast, of course, no Thunder Blast whatsoever for Colossus. So we're not wasting the 2 points in order to spec into Thunderlord. Instead, we're getting that extra rage gen, and we're also getting this rage gen from the new Whirling Blade as well, which I don't know if I touched on. It's essentially a passive Ravager, which procs, you know, 5 times a minute, I think is the PPM or something like that. So it's very frequent, and I really like it over regular Ravager. Not only is it -1 button, but it doesn't spend all the rage in a 1.5 minute burst of rage where you just feel overcapped. It's these smaller bursts of rage increase, which I think is a lot nicer. So that's why I generally recommend Whirling Blade over Ravager. But yeah, you go for a lot more rage gen as Colossus because you are lacking compared to Mountain Thane, so that helps you out a bit more in that regard. And then you have the bleed talent as well. Now that we've talked talents, let's move on to how the rotation actually functions, where both Mountain Thane and Colossus have similar priorities with some minor adjustments. As a quick note, I'm not going to be discussing those mid-length cooldowns, things like Avatar, Shield Charge, and Thunderous Roar in this section, as generally the rule here is to just send those as close to on cooldown as possible, unless they would be wasted by a mob going immune to damage or running away or a pack dying early, something like that. And for the most part, the best thing to do to optimize your damage is to just maximize the number of uses of these abilities. As mentioned earlier, the basics here are pretty straightforward. Shield Slam is your highest priority, as not only is it a ton of damage, it generates a lot of rage, and it also has synergies with both Thane and Colossus, where for Thane, it has a chance to proc those Thunder Blasts, as we just touched on, and for Colossus, it grants stacks of Colossal Might, which buffs up your abilities. It can also be reset by several of our abilities thanks to the Strategist talent, so you never want this to sit off cooldown for too long, as that means you will potentially waste some of those resets. Similarly, Thunderclap or Thunder Blast for Thane also wants to be kept on cooldown for damage and resource generation reasons. Speaking of resource generation, we need a way to spend it, which for the most part happens with Ignore Pain and Shield Block, but if you have some free globals and are sitting on some excess rage, you can use abilities like Revenge and Execute to dump some of that for damage, which are also abilities that have a chance to reset that Shield Slam like we just mentioned, so you can use these to also fish for additional procs. No matter what you choose to spend rage on, it's important that you never cap, because that's wasted potential from the anger management talent, which reduces the cooldown of both Avatar and Shield Wall based on the rage that you spend. So the less rage you waste here, the more uptime you're going to have on both of these strong cooldowns. Spending more rage also leads to more procs of Violent Outburst, which empowers the damage and rage generation of your next Shield Slam or Thunderclap. Plus on top of that, it also gives you a free Ignore Pain, so this is very powerful if used correctly. In general, you'll always want to consume these procs using a Shield Slam cast, even in AoE, though this priority does change slightly for Mountain Thane specifically, as Thunder Blast also gets amped by this talent. So in situations generally above 5 targets, if you have a Thunder Blast charge, you'd rather use that to consume this proc. Or if you're in situations with 2 targets or more and you're an Avatar or you get a tier bonus proc, then Thunder Blast also takes priority to consume these procs over Shield Slam. That being said, you do not want to sit here not Shield Slamming, waiting for a Thunder Blast to proc so you can consume this. If you have Shield Slam available, just send it and then continue your rotation as normal. You don't want to waste GCDs because of this. Drilling into the hero tree specifics a bit more here, Mountain Thane brings a lot more priority to Thunderclap through those Thunder Blast procs, which also reset the cooldown and can stack up to 2 charges of, so you can bank them if you can't use them in time. Avatar also immediately gives you 2 charges of this ability, so you always get some big bursts right when you press that CD, which is why it has some nice synergy with Spear. These extra resets mean that you have more globals spent on those generators, plus you've also got some passive synergy in that hero tree, which we covered in the talent section, to increase your rage generation in general, meaning this hero tree does play a bit faster with the APM, since you'll be pressing a lot more of that Ignore Pain button off the global cooldown. But thanks to that, it also has more Avatar CDR and even more Violent Outburst procs, assuming you played correctly. In this tier specifically, with the execute talent changes, we're also seeing a fair bit more of that rage generated being used to execute in both raid and mythic plus, which is one of the big advantages it has currently over Colossus. Speaking of Colossus, the slower of the two hero specs is built around the demolish cooldown, which, because it deals so much damage in such a short window, is something that you ideally want to line up both avatar and demoralizing shout with when it's empowered by the booming voice talent in order to make it a damage amp. Demolish itself also applies a damage amp to targets hit, so it becomes this burst window where you try and amp the damage of Demolish specifically as much as you can, and then you send all of your big damage CDs after that, where they get that double amp. Outside of that, Colossus does a lot more damage with both bleeds as well as revenge, which is good because you have a lot more open globals than Mountain Thane, as you don't have those Thunder Blast procs, so you can fill that with revenge, which feels pretty good. It also has a bit more crit synergy than Mountain Thane, including crit damage bonuses and faster Colossal Might stat gain, so the stat gains a bit of value for this hero tree specifically. With rotation down, let's move on talking a bit more about the defensive layers of Prot Warrior and what cooldowns you have at your disposal in order to help you survive, starting of course with the first line of defense, Shield Block. While active, this guarantees that you block any attack that is actually blockable, which notably is not all of them, so beware. And it also gives you the chance to critically block based on your mastery, which doubles the mitigation amount. This is extremely important to have active whenever you are tanking, as at the very least you will be blocking melee swings coming your way. Plus there's also some offensive upside as your shield slam gains 30% increased damage while this buff is active. And in general here, your goal is to have this as close to 100% uptime as possible. Paired with shield block is a spammable absorb shield and ignore pain, which mitigates 50% of incoming damage, drastically smoothing out your damage intake. Like shield block, this is also off the global cooldown, meaning you can and will be spamming this button in order to prevent yourself from capping on rage while also doing your rotation at the same time. Mountain Thane specifically also tends to talent into Brutal Vitality, which further empowers your ignore pain shields based on the damage dealt, which is especially good in harder content that eats into those shields faster. On the other hand, Colossus tends to favor the other option on this choice node in Fueled by Violence, granting them a pretty significant sustain increase thanks to their higher bleed damage, particularly with that new tier bonus, which is something Prot Warrior has not had in previous seasons, so this is an interesting addition. In terms of other defensive buffs to maintain, there isn't a ton because Shield Block and Ignore Pain cover the vast majority of your damage intake on their own, but there are a couple small DRs worth mentioning. For Mountain Thane, that is an 8% DR for 5 seconds whenever you use Thunder Blast, which has some very nice uptime this season thanks to the resets from your new tier bonus. And then Colossus has a similarly small 10% DR for 10 seconds attached to Demolish itself, so it's a bit stronger than the Mountain Thane version, but will have less overall uptime. Next, let's talk about your short defensive cooldowns, where there's a couple abilities to be aware of. First up is the iconic Spell Reflect ability, which has 3 different main functions. First, it can deflect damage, preventing it entirely. That's pretty strong. Second, even better than that, it can reflect damage to prevent that damage entirely and then deal damage back to the target. And third, which is the least ideal of the options, it can act as a flat damage reduction against magic damage for the duration, which isn't as good as deflecting or reflecting, of course, but if those spells or abilities hitting you are not deflectable or reflectable, this is the next best thing. To figure out exactly what this works against, I would recommend checking out Sense's Spell Reflect sheet, which I'll link down in the description below. It's a great resource that he puts together every season for both dungeons and raids, and is something you'll definitely want to study if you are a Prot Warrior. For a more general damage reduction, there's also Demoralizing Shout, which is an AoE debuff that reduces damage dealt to you by 25% to all nearby targets. This is a couple talents that also amplify it further, with Booming Voice adding rage generation and a damage amp to effective targets, and then Thunderlord adding CDR based on the number of targets you hit with Thunderclap. This combo makes it a very short cooldown with both offensive and defensive value, so generally you will not want to sit on this ability for too long, and instead can send it pretty close to on CD in order to smooth out your damage intake. But don't be afraid to hold it for a few seconds if the mitigation aspect is important for something specific, or if you are Colossus and you're not running Thunderlord and you want to line it up with your Demolish. Then we have the longer cooldown defensives, where the big one is Shield Wall. It's a 40% DR on a 3-minute cooldown baseline. However, there are a lot of ways to reduce that cooldown, and in reality, it's actually a lot closer to 1 minute than it is 3. You can also get a second charge of this ability from the Defender's Aegis talent, which you will be commonly taking, so you are able to then use this ability fairly frequently and even bank charges if you need them later. Outside of Shield Wall is Last Stand, which is pretty underwhelming in my opinion, so much so that half the builds don't even spec into this talent anymore, and it's essentially just a tax to get that previously mentioned Thunderlord ability. If you do take this, it's essentially just a 30% heal that also increases your max health by the same number. Not really super impactful. Maybe nice if you're dipping low a little bit, you need to heal yourself back up for a big hit or something like that. But otherwise, again, not super useful. And while it does have some additional talents that amplify its effect a bit, these aren't powerful either right now and not really worth the point investment in Season 3, so we're not going to worry about those. From there, let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, stats and gearing, where as always, item level is king. Prot Warrior, like many other tank specs, really want those increases in strength, stamina, and armor. Plus, on top of that, the differences between the secondaries in terms of their output isn't actually that large either, so in almost all situations, wearing the item that is higher item level is the correct choice. But of course, you can't always sim yourself if you are trying to figure out the exact best offensive option. When comparing jewelry or equipment of similar item level, generally you'll favor things with haste, as this not only decreases your global cooldown, allowing you to use abilities more frequently, it also reduces the base cooldown of abilities like Shield Slam, Thunderclap, and Shield Block, which makes the rotation flow nicer and also increases rage generation, which further fuels cooldown reduction. On top of all of that, it makes it easier to maintain that shield block buff as well, which is extremely important for your mitigation. After haste, both crit and versatility are fairly close, with crit generally being better for damage, particularly for Colossus with all that crit synergy. It's also good defensively in Mythic Plus scenarios, where you have a large volume of melee swings, as crit directly translates to parry rating. Versatility, on the other hand, is just a flat damage amp and DR. Where it's specifically better than crit, though, is at mitigating non-parryable damage events such as magic hits or bleed, which is something that potentially warriors may struggle with. Overall, there's no clear winner here, so getting a mix of these two stats is totally fine and something you're probably going to be pretty happy with. Last up is Mastery, which is generally your worst stat, but like I mentioned earlier, even the gap between this and your best stat in Haste is not that big, so it is not the end of the world if some of your gear has Mastery on it. You're not going to go out of your way and wear lower item level pieces to avoid this stat. Moving on to crafted gear, in terms of embellishments, it's looking like another Dawn Thread season, as Prot Warriors tend to get a fair bit of value out of this effect, as it's much easier for them to maintain that relatively high health threshold that it requires to have that crit buff, thanks to things like Ignore Pain. If you don't want to deal with potentially losing this effect at times, you can always opt for Elemental Focusing Lens, though this option has no potential defensive upside since it's just a flat damage proc. Also, something to keep in mind this tier specifically is where you craft these effects onto, as there's both the Reshiwrap's cloak and the boots from the raid that enhance it, taking up 2 potential slots. This basically leaves you with jewelry for the focusing lens, or bracers, belt, and whatever tier off piece for the Dawn Thread. When it comes to things like trinkets, that's going to be a significantly longer explanation with a lot of things good in different situations. So instead of me trying to spell all that out in this video and taking 20 minutes, I'm instead going to recommend that you check out the written guide on the Method website, which is maintained by Nate. He's an amazing tank player. He does keep that up to date with all the current tuning. He's got his thoughts on all the trinkets, when they're good, where you should use them, etc. I will link that down below. It's pretty thorough, so you should definitely check it out. Otherwise, that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully you learned something, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more tank, Mythic Plus, and raid guide content. Of course, this wouldn't be possible without the support of my Patreons, so shout out to you guys, and I'll see everyone in the next video.